Go for it.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Rotary Club of New York. Tonight is December the 30th, 2020. It has been quite a year. Rotary Club is the host club of America, and this is our 111th year in existence. And hopefully next year, our 112th will be a lot better than the one we've just been through. So I, like everyone else, we are anticipating a bit apprehensive about what the future will bring. So tonight we have a very special panel of we're very, very fortunate to have a group of really quite renowned guests who will be giving us some insight as to what we can expect our cities to be like post-COVID. So rather than me introduce them, I'm going to turn it over to the chair of our membership committee, who I have to say has been doing a superb job. She's exquisite, fantastic, quite possibly the best chair of membership committee we've ever had. But in any event, let me introduce Balor to Merchador, who will introduce our guests and the moderators tonight. And let's sit back and enjoy. And please don't be afraid to pose questions. Balor.
Thank you so much, President Gerard. Good evening, everyone. Happy holidays, distinguished Rotarians and global shapers and young professionals all over the world. And we are very fortunate to have industry experts tonight to discuss about the future of cities and how the city is gonna change after COVID, post-COVID. So our first guest speaker is Anthony Fieldman, who is the National Design Director for HOK Canada and serves on HOK's board of directors. He's splitting his time between Toronto and New York. And Anthony provides design leadership for projects across Canada and throughout the world. His work has been widely recognized, exhibited, and published with over 50 international design awards spanning 25 years of professional practice. Thank you so much, Anthony, for joining. And the next guest speaker we are very lucky to have Josh Sierfman. He's a co-founder and senior advisor who formerly served as a president of Google Sidewalk Labs. And Josh has spent his career at the forefront of the planning, negotiation, and implementation of complex growth and development strategies across the public and private sectors. And this session will be moderated by global shippers from New York Hub. Lebo Mahler, she's an ESG investment professional focusing on infrastructure finance, and Shaz Nasir, he's a director of digital transformation for public service at Microsoft. Thank you so much for everyone taking your time to joining us, and stage is yours, Shaz and Anthony.
Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the warm welcome. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully this will work. And you will have to let me know if it does.
Yes, I see it.
Okay. So I've prepared some slides and Josh and I spoke a little bit earlier. I think what we're going to do is dovetail one after the other. I've actually known Josh quite some time, well over a decade. And so we're, there wasn't all that much prep that needed to happen, I think, because we know one another and kind of what our points of view are. So we're just going to launch into it because I know time is of the essence. I'm going to share from the point of view of as an architect and kind of an urbanist, a little bit of a history lesson before heading into where everything that I hear and read about and our own folks say cities are going. And I think that'll dovetail nicely in with what Josh is going to talk, where he dives deeper into some specific scenarios. But first to kind of frame this, I hear all the time, cities are dead, they're dying, that they're untenable anymore. And the people saying that are frankly the people that have always said that, and the people that didn't want to be there to begin with. They're the people that are there primarily because of jobs. And jobs has been the kind of engine of city growth for 200 years. But with that said, cities do have to be reinvented now for one reason only, which is that economics will no longer, I think, be the prime driver of their growth. So for the overwhelming majority of history, this is what we looked like, right? We didn't live in cities. Until about 13,000 years ago, for all of human existence, we lived in Dunbar-sized tribes, 100 and 150 people. We knew each other intimately. We hunted, we gathered, we trusted one another, and we did what every other animal did. And then at some point, around 6,000 years ago, after agriculture took hold, the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia, India, China, Egypt all changed that because we had the ability for the first time in history to produce, gather, and store prodigious amounts of food as a surplus for the first time. So suddenly the small tribes of trusted members were supplanted by large swarms of transacting strangers, which sowed mistrust and necessitated the invention of systems of cooperation and governance. So things like the division of labor, infrastructure, laws, and eventually narrative identities were all created to align human activity among strangers. So as the so-called city-state stabilized, empires were founded, and the stronger communities began to prey on the bounty of the weaker ones. Sumerians, Egyptians, then the Persians, Greeks, Romans, Chinese, the Indus Valley, Khmer, Mongols, all of them, hundreds of empires throughout history, are really what human history was once we settled down, until about 200 years ago. And what happened then, as most everybody knows, was a couple of industrial revolutions. The complex inventions that came with it required specialized workers who gladly left their farms and cottage industries in order to earn more money than they could at home. It was that simple. And for the first time in human history, productivity wasn't limited by the body. So the powerful machines and the people that operated them ushered in that new age, and cities boomed. And that was City 2.0, right? Economics were its engine. And it was mostly on the backs of this guy, Adam Smith, whose book, Wealth of Nations, was actually published the same year as American independence. And it's inseparable from the rise of City 2.0. Smith imagined an underclass of laborers held down by low wages to boost productivity and boost profit, which gave rise to a master class of industrialists, which of course exacerbated class divisions, which increased dramatically under capitalism, where they remain today. And cities largely reflect that. So the invisible hand of competition and demand in Smith's free market became in reality a steady stream of workers who were forced to accept inadequate wages, horrible working conditions, and long hours to afford increasingly unaffordable basics like food and shelter. And it was interesting because throughout all of urban history until that point, urbanization was flat at 10%. 10% of the world lived in cities. And you can see this chart. After that, it just skyrocketed. In the US leads the world with 82% of its citizens in urban centers. And what's interesting is that people like the UN are projecting now that 67%, 2/3 of humans will ultimately live in cities by the year 2050. They might be right, but given the last 10 months, and this is where City 3.0 comes in, it might be for a very different reason. And I think it'll look very different from what we all imagined it just a year ago. So City 3.0 was born about 10 months ago when the world shut down, sending workers home. Until then, the engine of City 2.0 had been jobs, even though many workers hated city life. They were there for one reason only, which was the jobs. The post-war birth of the suburb was American workers' attempt to reconcile life for those who loved money and hated urbanity. They lived in homogeneous, low-density, lower-cost enclaves that they craved while commuting into the city to make a living. In 2013, a staggering 86% of Americans commuted to work by car, according to the US Census Bureau. That's cumulatively 30 billion hours per year just in America. And we all know what that looked like. In New York, until March, 1 million of these day workers came and went every day. And all of a sudden it stopped. Suburbanites stayed home. As cities went on lockdown, traffic dried up and trains sat empty. Everyone apart from essential workers stayed home, and because of this, swaths of the economy cratered, which they remain today. And I would say it's never really going to go back to the way it was. And that's not because COVID created the situation, it just accelerated a trend that was already gathering steam. Researchers have found that fewer than 10% of workers have any interest in resuming a 5-day commute, even a local one by public transit. The convenience of being home is just too great. It gives us control over our schedule, handling what we need to, when we need to, without supervisors or distractions, the cost of lunch, or the expense of travel. Working remotely is a genie we're not going to stuff back in the bottle. But it was always bound to happen. The internet, with limitless resources and global connectivity, have long made it possible to decouple work and the office. The digital age has fed a massive expansion of self-employment, which is funny because for the first 6,000-year run of City 1.0, before capitalism took over, self-employment was the default. It was City 2.0 that changed that. Today, over a third of the US workforce is self-employed, growing by 50% in the last decade alone. In the UK, it's even higher at 88% growth. Everywhere, self-employment's increasing dramatically. And by 2027, the majority of the US workforce is projected to be comprised of contract workers, the majority. The gig economy is alive and well, and it was already bound to be the future of work. The rise of co-working companies like WeWork, among thousands of others, and separately purveyors of meeting space on demand like Convene in New York, both understand that work is now wherever you happen to be. They've replaced tedium, sameness, and homogeneity of an office with a dynamic network of spaces and people who may or may not work in your company or even industry, but who will assuredly enrich you and your work and your social lives. And that was all before COVID. So the impact on cities that remote work will have, fewer commuters in a shrinking central business district, can't be overstated. Most experts believe that non-gig workers will settle into a hub and spoke and home model, where you'll meet at the hub periodically for purpose like teaming or collaboration, but not for heads down work. Distributed spokes will be used much more often as convenient places to go near home, get out of the house, plug into premium tech, enjoy coffee, and network with other gig workers or digital nomads. Companies will likely, and already are, frankly, many of the Fortune 500 companies already renting seats or hours from dedicated operators to accommodate a fluid workforce. Home will remain what it's always been, which is the most convenient place to work. But what it doesn't do well is build community, company culture, or for some people provide the best working environment because of people like in this photo who have kids, spouses, and other distractions. And for some, tech is still a barrier. So as an outcome of this redistribution of work, I think cities will shrink because many of us who no longer have to be there for work will choose not to. So what happens to all that real estate and to streets that are suddenly free of traffic, blaring horns, and pollution? Why move or even stay in a city at all if its prime draw, economics, is now largely moot? Many people will leave cities for good, and overall, I think they'll shrink. I have friends who've already decamped to the Adirondacks, Charleston, Costa Rica, Connecticut, and Bali, effectively choosing to live where they want and adjusting their work circumstances to suit the environment. This directly contravenes 200 years of history as a trend. Most people, however, will remain in cities, but their choice will be governed more by lifestyle than employment. But regardless, if the city's not a job engine, then what exactly is it? So the idea of creative density, a rich exchange of ideas is the de facto source of innovation. Creative hubs like those that abound in New York, like Industry City, New Lab, the Starrett Lehigh Building, Brooklyn Navy Yards, and the forthcoming Made in New York campus, among many others, are as much what makes New York today as anything. This rising creative class powered by tech and one another intuitively coalesce into clusters because that's what fuels their creative reach. Cities, therefore, will continue to attract people because of other people with whom they can build relationships, share resources, and incubate ideas in an era of rapid innovation and unbound creativity. But it's not just work. the biggest ones, the biggest cities have long been centers of culture, places where the arts flourish, like live music in Austin, theater in London, fine arts in New York, pretty much everything in New York, museums in Mexico City, the spoken word in San Francisco, culinary arts in Kyoto, et cetera, et cetera. Cities will remain magnets for those seeking to be either the creator or audience in these pursuits. The cultural landscape of cities will likely deepen as culture and economics rebalance. And we can't forget that we're social creatures to our cores. For as difficult as the trade-offs of city living have been in the modern era, they are a wellspring of social exchange, the richest kind, and there's no force on earth that'll change that. The last time New York City fell on hard economic times, and Josh and I were talking about that earlier, was the most socially and creatively dense era in the city's history, giving birth in large part to the cultural landscape that we all still talk about and with which we identify the city itself. But things are going to change. So this is from a 2015 article I remember reading back then. Morgan Stanley found that cars are used on average just 4% of the time and cost owners on average $9,000 a year. The car ownership era is nearly over. Rideshare options, both four-wheel and two-wheel, and on-demand rentals will combine with clean tech like zero-emission and driverless vehicles to make self-driving, pollution, gridlock, and ownership mostly a thing of the past. It's not just companies like Tesla whose self-driving cars are already on the road and making me nervous every time my daughter and her mom get in a car together and they go to sleep on their way home. Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Aptiv, Baidu, Intel, Bosch, and Cisco, and others are already investing heavily in this space. In 2015, Columbia University, a study showed that low-cost, low-weight transportation cloud will quickly become the dominant form of movement in cities. PricewaterhouseCoopers predicts that a staggering 99% of cars will come off the road. Traffic and parking will become non-existent, making traffic signals, greenhouse gases, delays, parking garages, and even parking lanes a thing of the past. As a bonus, emergency vehicle responsiveness will get better, and majority of deaths and injuries from cars will vanish. Food production will continue to go hyperlocal. I actually served on a board some years ago by a food incubator startup. It not only will take over underutilized rooftops, but it'll go indoors, vertical, all season, soil-free, and artificially lit, in garages and former office buildings everywhere that are now empty. The carbon footprint of food will reduce dramatically, while freshness, nutrient quality, and shelf life will all increase. Because of this, the cost to market will continue to plummet as techniques and scale evolve. With the low cost and high convenience of on-demand, at-grade travel, the entire underbelly of the city, the subway system, can and will be adapted into a network for commercial and retail deliveries, finally removing the trucks from the newly pedestrianized streetscape. Subterranean vehicles will feed a distributed network of holding facilities for local pickup, or kind of an army of Amazonian workers will make the bridge between depot and doorstep. They've already filed a patent. This is Amazon's patent for an underground delivery system. So what do we do with all that public space? The public realm, streets, sidewalks, etc., typically comprise roughly 50% of a city's footprint. With 99% fewer cars on the road, the most dramatic makeover will probably happen there. The street will belong once again to the pedestrian. New York's High Line points to one version of what the streets could begin to look like. Asphalt will no longer be king. Every road will become a plaza, a park, or a playground. And like 10,000 restaurants already in New York, open-air dining will proliferate. In short, it'll look a lot like Europe, old Europe. So cities will shrink, I believe, since people who otherwise don't like city living won't need to stay. There's a cataclysmic change for the Smithian faithful, the capitalists who see cities as engines of economic growth quarter over quarter, not simply as places for people. In other words, cities will revert to places for those who want to be there rather than feel they have to. And as the world's most tolerant, inclusive, and diverse communities, which is what cities really are, they will finally begin to close the gap on the haves and the have-nots. Cities won't be the only or even prime economic engines anymore. A global fragmentation of the workforce will allow people to choose the beach or the forest over the concrete jungle. Like a snowshoe, the workforce will be distributed everywhere. And here's a nod to Josh. Smaller communities will arise for the first time since City 1.0 as like-minded Dunbar-sized enclaves pool resources to live with the land rather than against it, while transacting with the rest of the world digitally, economically. Silicon Valley's Jordan Hall, whose brilliant Civium project envisions a world in which global connectivity and commune-like living coexist, is just one high-profile example. Other so-called Game B communities, the likes of which are incubating all over, are testing new models of living enabled by digital ubiquity. So cities will have to become more livable. The public realm, cultural landscape, and institutions that support quality living and ultimately the cost of living itself, equity and affordability, will all need to improve if the city is to survive the changes. Once a central business district is no longer king, the cities will have to adapt or fall by the wayside. So the post-COVID city will have to address the obvious, which is that we're all working from home, even after COVID, and in the future, we'll continue to do so at least part of the time. The home office will have to get a makeover as developers make them part of the suite of amenities they market and sell. Dog parks and screening rooms will likely take a backseat to blazing bandwidth and quiet spaces in our priority lists. People's choice of multi-unit dwellings will depend partly on how landlords and developers address these needs. A major overhaul of older properties will need to happen to make them marketable in this new normal. In addition, I believe small resident-focused co-working environments will spring up in buildings everywhere, the way gyms did in the preceding decade, not only answering the need for workspace at home and indoors, but also for the social benefits that come with sharing space. Because of this, neighbors will feel less isolated from one another, and new relationships will form the way they do regularly in co-working environments. Many of the people I met during my years at Neue House remain close friends today, years later. Friendship is one of the great perks of the dynamic workplace. Buildings will finally become micro-communities. Like other amenities that'll emerge in order to deepen bonds between residents, things like that are intrinsically social, like gardening, cooking, maker spaces, and co-working, among other things, should and will emerge. So finally, my last two slides, I think, the sustainable city is nigh and it's super green. And this is the kind of image everybody sees all the time. The Paris Agreement's just one measure, but the problem is that it's national. Solutions need to be much more granular, local. C40 is a collection of 97 cities worldwide so far, representing 1/12 of the entire world's population. It's more than a commitment by sovereign municipalities to clean up their own backyards. Like more and more things these days, it's first and foremost a network. And as such, it's been set up to pool research, knowledge management, peer-to-peer exchange, and communications to ensure that cities move farther, faster towards curbing carbon emissions together. Final thought, when cities are no longer smog engines or polluters, when the streets are green and quiet, when more and more of the citizens are there because they want to be, when cultural investment blossoms, when food is produced everywhere nearby, when the chief reason to leave home is to collaborate, socialize, or play, when the physical environment of the city supports us as we always hoped it would, supplying copious amounts of choice, dynamism, energy, friendship, and creativity, when the streets are green, healthy, and richly programmed, and when most of the building's doors are open and lead to on-demand spaces and services, then City 3.0 will flourish. It surely will be the best version of cities yet. And when it's here, people will flock to municipalities everywhere, delivering for a very different reason on the United Nations now obsolete employment-based projection of 67.5% urbanization. It'll be that way because cities are and always have been the most dynamic, richly textured, creative, diverse, social, tolerance, incubating places to be. And there's nothing that would ever replace them. I'm done.
Lebo, okay, if I go ahead?
Yes, please do.
I'll take that as a yes. While I'm figure out how to share my screen. Thank you, Anthony. I elect to live there.
You and me both.
Okay, can you all see my screen? Great, thank you, Anthony, and thank you for all that. Some of what I'm going to talk about is a little bit redundant with Anthony's presentation, but I'm mostly going to focus on some thoughts about how we might get to that place. And in particular, I've spent the last 6 years or so living at the nexus of urbanism and technology, and some of the paths that perhaps that provides for us. Interestingly, as Anthony alluded to, pre-COVID, at least in the US and arguably other places, the cities, major cities were already subject to massive issues and challenges. And you'll see here the pace of growth, which for those of us who have experienced ups and downs in New York is truly a lifeline for the city, really started to actually recede in key ways. COVID has, of course, increased this impact in dramatic ways, unprecedented. None of us had thought that such a thing could happen. But what's most important, and Anthony mentioned this, is that it's really served as an accelerant and an amplifier. And there are many things that are either patterns, trends, issues, challenges, undercurrents that the pandemic has just brought a bright spotlight shining right on it and amplified it dramatically. What are some examples? First and foremost, there is no better example, especially for those of us in the United States, as to the impact it's had on exposing and compounding systemic inequities that have been part of the fabric of cities from day one. First and foremost. Secondly, it's truly accelerated the adoption of digital capability and exposed where that doesn't, people don't have access to it, but as the lifeline for how we function. And it's accelerated that absolutely dramatically, and not just in how we shop, but literally every aspect. Having just had a daughter's bat mitzvah, on Zoom, it's dramatic. It's a different universe. It's also really accelerated the blurring of boundaries. The roof of a building is now a yoga studio. Your home is your office. Nothing is what it seems in the physical environment in particular, and the way that we use things has just adapted enormously. And it's really pushed this notion that use is a very defined by strict categories in cities, that you do something here and you do something else over there. And it's really accelerated that notion of that our lives want to reflect everything we do in a singular place. Anthony mentioned this as well, but of course there is probably no greater threat for all of us than climate change. And it's really exposed how much cities, which already were a huge driver of the on-the-ground fight against climate change, but the responsibility and obligation that cities have to take this on. And it's created something that, for those of us that are planning geeks, has always been a sort of notion, but it's really amplified this concept of everything I want to do and everything I need is within close proximity, whether it's walking distance or however one measures it, but that it starts to break down, as Anthony mentioned, this notion of the sort of center point and everything that happens as hub and spoke around it, that you want neighborhoods. And this is a very local concept, but it actually dovetails with the notion of also continuing to live in a global world. In many ways, this is a crisis of epic proportions. A couple of us were talking before we started the program about New York City, and in many ways, this is a greater crisis for New York City structurally than the bankruptcy and fiscal crisis in 1975. And absent intervention, it starts that vicious cycle of contraction and less jobs, less revenue, less investment. And so we're really at a pivotal moment for cities. I'm a little New York centric, and it's incredibly true here, but it's really true in many places, and cities, I should say, of all scales. The flip side is that it's an extraordinary opportunity. I had the opportunity to be in the public sector as part of the administration of Michael Bloomberg here in New York City right after 9/11. And the reality was for us, while 9/11 was obviously a complete and total disaster, it gave us opportunity. It allowed us to think differently about the city. It pushed us to not take for granted the city's competitive position and the city's ability to create quality of life for its citizens. Similarly, this is a massive opportunity. And somebody put a question here while Anthony was speaking about how do you explain the spike in purchase of cars. I think it's a perfect question because it says like there is a moment right now where cities have to be bold and take big steps now that are going to be counter to, in some ways, the day-to-day of how we function. And yes, people are buying cars now because transit's scary, but you have to take big steps now that are going to push into the next generation of cities. So I thought I might just walk through some ideas. Some are big, some are tiny, but it's really all about how does technology start to meet the built environment in ways that enable, honestly, the beautiful city that Anthony described. First, use what we have. Public space has been this extraordinary canvas for the pandemic. It's been the venue for so much that has transpired through all of this. It's been a lifeline. How do we make sure that we create more in all the right places for everyone? There are certain ways. Anthony talked about new mobility. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this conversation, although I'm happy to in Q&A, about mobility solutions themselves. But the reality is it's coming, autonomous mobility, lots of ways for us to move around differently. But we also at the same time have to think about, therefore, how do we completely redesign those roads and how do we liberate that space? And in fact, if you take that step now and assume the future of transportation, you can start to adopt the streets accordingly and free up incredible space. If you think about networks that we have that can be created now simply through technology, think about parking and how do we actually start to liberate that land, even if it takes quite a long time for all the new mobility solutions to eliminate autos. There are so many parking facilities, everybody has their own. The efficiency across them is ridiculous. It's not that complicated to network them and actually reduce dramatically how we do that, and how they're used and how they serve them. Another idea, this gets a little bit to the question somebody posted about what governance system this all assumes, but think differently. Anthony, you mentioned about the in-building amenities start to change. What about thinking about amenities on a neighborhood basis? What about the gym in the apartment building that's used 4 hours a day? How many other community members could use that? You think about the trust-based technology systems that an app like an Uber is introduced into our lives. You could very easily create across a neighborhood access to amenities and not think about it at the building to building level. There are advanced materials that can increase the time that we are able to spend outdoors, for example. Anthony showed an image of my projects in Toronto that we at Sidewalk Labs had advanced. And we did an enormous amount of design and calculated in that climate, which is not the best. We could get 30% more comfortable hours outdoors. So if you start to free up that space, maybe there's also creative ways to use technology to use it. We want to live flexibly, and we want to have our communities and cities need to be flexible. Again, to the streets, there are design principles about how we use streets that can inform that. Not every street is equal, not every street has to be used the same way, and they could be managed in a way that can be dynamic. You can start think about that 15-minute community, that everything within it. If you work and live in close proximity, you can think about your streets designs, as I mentioned before, entirely differently. Our buildings need to be thought about differently. It may just be that there is a dramatic increase in the amount of work from home. For many people, while it's been wonderful, it's also been difficult and had brought its own set of issues. There are physical capabilities now, whether it's digital electricity, which takes wires out of the wall, that can allow for literally modular living in your unit, that can allow it to adapt as to how you want to live and what kind of space that you need. There's furniture, robotic furniture advancements. This is actually a company called Ori that we've worked closely with, that can make your studio apartment feel like a one bedroom. And there's all kinds of applications of this capability. For now, it's focused on the millennial market that is going to be in major cities with smaller units. But there's all kinds of possibility to think about in the home. It doesn't have to be the static thing that we're also so used to. This whole notion of having all this space to convert. One of the things I focused on here is this notion of performance-based regulation. All of this innovation is only possible if government is really looking forward. And this is an example where we have all kinds of obsolete assets, especially if in fact the in-office workforce starts to reduce a little bit. I personally think there will be more in-office work. It'll take a couple of years to get back to it, but I think it will come back a little bit more strongly than Anthony portrayed. But nevertheless, if you start thinking less about land use governance as to this building must be this or it must be that, and think about just the performance, you need light, you need air, you need safety, you need things. There are ways to monitor this that can actually help us reinvent our obsolete assets. And lastly, I should mention a sort of shift from the notion of broadband access as, in this country for 25 years, we've been talking about it, that it should be universal. It truly needs to be considered a utility and accessible to all. And there are technologies, I'm not an expert on, but there are technologies that are actually quite advanced in making that efficient and inexpensive to achieve and effective. And then all of this, we have the opportunity now to manage dynamically. I think one of the most important things that to come out for cities coming out of the pandemic is that we've had to respond to situations in a time frame unlike anything we've experienced. The notion of one day schools are open and the next day they're not, or, one day you have to do this and the next day it changes, is actually a harbinger of things that we can do because we want to, not because we have to. So for example, if you think about city building and city shaping, those of us in the industry, it takes a long time and it's complicated. We can use tools now to look at different possibilities in extraordinarily fast timeframes. Again, referencing Toronto and some of the work I was involved in there, using the modeling tools that we developed, we came up with ways to find better ways to build, better ways to create neighborhoods, better ways to create more public space more efficiently, and in very fast timeframes. The important point here, though, is that this can be applied in many ways to change the timeframe in which we function in our cities. How we think about the interplay between online, internet, and bricks and mortar. Retail, perhaps the single greatest area of total destruction, and also probably the single greatest area of activating urban environments. There are ways to start thinking about it. There are ways to track that bricks and mortar actually help online sales for stores. And if you look at it holistically, you can benefit the retailer, the landlord, the whole ecosystem. So again, won't go into detail here, but there are opportunities to be ahead of it. Again, back to the streets and how we manage it. We can actually know what's happening in real time on the streets. So that you could have your street be, have a throughway lane from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. and then become a park until 3 p.m. And that's a very manageable thing. And we have the capabilities to do these things. On the sustainability front, we are going to need to move to entirely electrification and away from natural gas. And there are ways to start to do this where you can manage peak demand, create affordable electrification. Again, Lebo is better qualified than I am to speak to this kind of stuff. But one example I think is extraordinary we've been involved in is creating a virtual grid with individual energy consumers. We're doing this in California through a company we created, Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners, who's funding a company called OwnConnect, where they pay consumers to reduce their usage at peak times. And essentially, because you have that smart thermostat, you're able to contribute to the grid and manage accordingly. And over time, this could replace all of the peak generation that's required and maybe even start to reduce total generation. It's incredibly exciting. And again, it's simple about taking advantage of creating networks where we couldn't before. And lastly, I should mention this is not just about the built environment. In healthcare, we created a company called CityBlock that's focused on sort of the full circle of care for, particularly for low-income communities, and had enormous success. And in the pandemic, it's been so clear how critical that is. And again, just simply by using, it's not simple, but by using a technology platform as part of the connective tissue, you can start to create new opportunities. So I just mentioned this because it's not only about the built environment. And lastly, I would say that all of this is also possible because there are actually ways to start approaching how we manage data, how we manage privacy and data security with transparency, with security, with clear governance that can enable these things to start to become tools for cities to use on a regular basis. So I tried to go fast. I will stop there, and hopefully we can get into some discussion.
Thank you both so much for your wisdom and your expertise. What we're going to do now is Lebo and I will kind of go back and forth and moderate some questions, and then of course address all the questions that are being typed out right now as well. So I guess to start off, I mean, in terms of making City 3.0 real, tax revenue and certain issues where you have certain people who are deciding to leave New York City, as an example, those folks tend to be of higher income. They kind of won at life, if you will. And so when they move, they do take their tax revenue away from the city, and thus City 3.0, it gets harder to fund that transformational effort. So what advice, I guess, or thoughts do you have on trying to solve for that issue that New York City is facing in the next few months, or maybe even years, hopefully?
You know, I'm not the economics expert, but what I will do is share a personal observation. So as somebody who spent 35 years in New York, but grew up in Montreal, Montreal cratered when 1 million Montrealers left because of the threat of separatism, which was splitting it in two, and they decamped to Toronto when Toronto went from a backwater to kind of the economic engine of Canada, right? And we were talking about the banks and the wealthy class and the Anglos, who were, the people who tend to be the white collar jobs. And what happened was Montreal went into at least 20, if not 25-year tailspin. What happened was it right-sized. It is, by anybody's opinion that you will ask, a dynamic, wonderful, culturally rich city to visit. Food, culture, arts, all of that stuff, a kind of a joie de vivre that Montrealers have, are all perfectly intact. What happened was it had economic hardship, but it harkens a little bit back, and it never got gritty like New York did in the 70s. But New York in the 70s also, Max's Kansas City, CBGB's, Studio 54, the invention of rap, all of these things, it was one of the biggest cultural incubators of all. So I think there's a right sizing and a kind of a redefinition of what a successful city is. At least that's my version of it. It's what I was trying to allude to. It's not just that cities are economic engines. We see that because we're steeped in capitalist mentality. But cities are far more than just economics. They are places of creativity, usually born out of difficulty.
Yep, absolutely. No, excellent.
I have a slightly different take, which is yes, where there is there's culture and other things can thrive, where there's affordable rents, where there's all the things that started to fade in New York from, in some ways, its own success. For New York City, it's critical to try to stem the flow a bit. And I think it's actually, first and foremost, in the immediate future, it's about leadership. And you'd be amazed, having lived through some of the things in government that I saw, the impact of what government can do in providing leadership is real. And I think for creating the environment in New York where people across all income levels feel like they're being thought about, that the city has a future, that there's a roadmap to what we're trying to do, I think is actually in the short term paramount. And it's, thank God we have an election coming up, because it creates a venue for that discussion and hopefully gets us a better quality leadership. I really think that that is critical. And, you know, we've been through this many times in New York, and I do think we will maintain our competitive advantage if we in fact adapt and say, it's going to look a bit different, and it's going to be different. And so we have to make choices about that, and it's going to take years, but we'll get there again.
Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you. LeBeau, I'll let you ask.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for the two wonderful presentations, Josh and Anthony. And for the both of you, I have this question because, I mean, very broadly, we've touched on so many important areas that really impact cities and how successful they are and how people thrive. And a big, you know, question is around, you know, equity and how people have equal access to certain opportunities. We've seen that, you know, COVID-19 has drastically highlighted the inequalities that prevail even in the workforce, as those who are further exposed to the virus, whether it's public health workers, public servants, you know, they're first responders. And what it is also that you've spoken to is around the inequalities around the world. And as we've seen, billionaires increase their wealth, the majority of people do face woeful economic circumstances. So I guess really when it comes to all the major disruptions, currently, you know, I even apologized right before the call, and I was like, guys, if my lights go out, please forgive me, because, you know, what Josh was saying, we have the benefit of certain cities having the opportunity to sort of shave off peak demand, and we call that demand response. In South Africa, we call it load shedding. So the utility just turns off your lights for you, and that's where my apology would have come from. And so we have a schedule we follow. So I guess the economic recovery of certain countries just will lag behind far worse than other countries. It's just the reality. We're due to receive our vaccine in Q2 per the president's announcement before, which means it'll slow down our economic recovery even more. So then when we really imagine future cities, we're not just talking about future cities in, you know, in the global north that have the opportunities to advance at far rapid rates and recover at far more rapid rates too. The resiliency of developing countries isn't quite as adaptable, and it's not quite as prepared. So I suppose then when it comes to this conversation, where mega cities principally fall in the developing countries, how do we then bring everybody into one agenda, one global conversation that leaves no one behind? Because in our recovery, I think there are a lot longer lasting effects of the virus, where, you know, our adaptation won't be as robust.
Oh, there's so many dimensions of resilience, and, you know, a lot of things. And again, all that I've been doing is trying to provoke potential outcomes. There's a lot of complexity around what actually ends up happening, right? And as Josh said, governance is a huge part of it, right? Setting the tone, calming people down, helping aim them towards either a difficult road ahead or certain things they can expect and be optimistic towards. There are so many different things. Urbanization of farming leads to food security. If you can grow it anywhere, you can grow it and you can eat, right? So that's something that takes care of that. I hate to be, I'm probably the contrarian here on this call or in this room, but you know, the cost of living in New York City is the result of an ecosystem of costs. Because it costs so much to have an apartment, you need to pay workers more than you would in another city. And because of that, then they can afford food because the rents are higher for the restaurants that then have to charge you more for the food. If one thing drops, the system has to recalibrate or else it craters. And so this idea, and I'm sorry to harp on this, but this idea, this very capitalist idea, and I'm not an anti-capitalist, by the way, but a very capitalist idea of quarter over quarter growth is so abstract, it means nothing to anybody, right? Yeah. What it really means is, can I afford what I need? Can I get an internet connection, which Josh talked about earlier, because my kids are in school and now sitting outside a public library or a Starbucks so they can get on their Zoom calls while they're quarantined in COVID because they can't go into school? Can I put food on my table? Is my rent affordable? If all of these things calibrate, if the wealthiest people that tip all those scales up to the $100 million apartments aligning 57th Street and the rest of it go away, there's a recalibration. If central business districts shrink, there's a recalibration. Things have to. So while it's not necessarily a desirable end state to everybody, for every loser, there's another winner, right? Which is what we were talking about earlier of feeling like you have access. So food security, education security, quality education, the cost of living in houses. If we get to net zero, and that is something my firm and my profession are deeply steeped in, then the cost of utilities and power and heating and cooling can reduce to nothing, right? As operational costs that are born off of a grid that's provided by the city as a different kind of utility. And so, you know, you can reduce costs that way, reduce energy, increase food security, increase access to the things that give one access to the best education of all, frankly, which is access to the world's history online. I actually think we're not talking about this, but education itself is going to shift drastically from I'm going to teach you something in a class to we're going to come together and actually discuss in the class what you learned on your own on your computer. And so all of these things potentially reduce the barriers for the people that have the least.
Absolutely. Josh, would you like to add some?
I mean, with your question, I'm far from an expert on global economics issues, and I mean, you touched on so many massive issues. I do think there are also opportunities, though, to sort of leapfrog status quo that are, you know, again, with appropriate governance, are stronger in, you know, a lot of the developing world versus, you know, whether it's the US or Western Europe. And I actually think if people are thoughtful and smart and aggressive about that, that in time, those economies will actually grow enormously, and perhaps even our, you know, the United States competitive position starts to fade if we're not. I do think the you know, really interesting to see. This has been such a disruption in everything that globalization has been about. I personally think that getting back to globalization in the appropriate way, with this country providing a constructive role, not a destructive role, is important for growth around the world. It's all about choices that are made. The pressure from climate change to actually invest in new areas has to lead to successes and growth strategies all over. There are so many things and so many variables that all of them hopefully will add up to successful strategies.
If I can add two more points here. You know, Tom Friedman was interviewed by Chris Cuomo just a couple of months ago in talking about energy and what he had wished Biden had said in one of the debates. But what he got into was a very Tom Friedmanian kind of diatribe about clean energy sector. And one of the interesting things he said is that actually that 72% of the current global investment in tech is clean, right? So what he said is people are already in transition, that the argument's over, it's already happening. And what he said was, it's really a question of, you know, is the United States going to be part of it, or are we going to start buying, you know, wind turbine pieces from China? So, you know, it's not a question of if. I think that boat has left, and it's actually artificial stimulus that's actually keeping the fossil fuels more affordable than otherwise they would be, because the price of any kind of clean modern technology, as Josh was alluding to, certain other countries kind of leapfrogging technologies, is those things are so modern in their sense that they're easy to reduce iteratively in their cost. So anyway, so energy security is going to be one thing that I think is going to happen anyway. And I forgot my other point, so sorry.
No, fantastic, excellent. We do have a lot of questions here from the audience, so I'm going to try to like do a 5 minutes as well. So I'm going to try to do like a fire.
I just let you know, guys, we can extend the session for 10 to 15 minutes. So yeah, just give it up.
Yeah, that makes it, if that's okay with everyone, if we could have more meaningful answers to these questions. Thank you, Laura. So, add another 10 to 15 if you may. So I'll just start with Dr. George here. I'm going to try to summarize all these questions. So does City 3.0 need a political revolution that would shift things, whether it's capitalism or socialism or state capitalism? And do you think that in order to bring to life City 3.0, and if the answer is that yes, we need to shift our political operations, and is that intentional? As he says, do you think that this creation of this post-COVID world is intentional, or is it just organic through the sheer force of what we're all been forced to do and live by in the last few months? Open question to anyone.
You reminded me of the second point, and I'll say it in brief, which was that there was Umair Haque is an interesting UK-based writer that I follow, and he published a graph recently about how much different countries of lost incomes the country is funding through their programs, starting up in the high 90s in Japan, if not close to 100% of one's lost income, all the way down to the United States with its, as you know, the $600 or $2,000 check that amounts to a half a week's worth of wages for somebody average, which is effectively zero. It gets back to what Josh was saying earlier about government. The government, whether it's capitalist or socialist or some other system, it needs to care first and foremost for its citizens. And it needs to do what it does well, which is rally the scale of operation that it has, the tax base and the influence around the world to make moves that protect its citizens. And so those are the ones ultimately that will fare better. I think it's less important whether it's a capitalist system or otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This question about intentional and not is very interesting, and the sort of balance between organic and intentional. I actually think that it has to be intentional to a point. You have to create the conditions that enable organic activity to thrive, and I think it's a moment now where cities, and that's what we're focused on here, I think cities have to be intentional about how they envision themselves in the future, and what steps they want to take to get there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Lebo, I can let you tackle the next one.
Absolutely. I'm also going to take on a question that has come up in the chat, and one of which that's just sort of been asked by Joseph Stern. Might it make more sense for the first City 3.0 to be planned and developed from scratch rather than attempting to restructure an already very structured city like New York City?
A fun question for me, because when we created Sidewalk Labs, it was my partner Dan Doctoroff and I started in a dialogue with a bunch of people. It was then Google before Alphabet was created, and we really started that the original conversation was about how could you what would be possible if you could leverage what technology can enable to create cities. And the technologist mindset was should it be an island in the ocean with no government, and so it's free from everything. And the evolution over years of wrestling with this is that I don't actually think you need that. I think that there's actually just as much that can be layered into the built, the established, the structured city. Are there a handful of things that are easier to do if you're building a city in the desert from scratch? Sure. But actually the reality is anything that's truly effective needs to also work at the already built environment and scale. And I've come to be a huge believer that it's not about that carte blanche canvas. It's in fact about integrating to whatever fabric, wherever that is.
Yeah, if
What?
I can add one point, I read an article 2 weeks ago called something like Why Utopias Fail. And there have been something like 483 utopian societies created in the past 150 years. And each one has failed spectacularly. And, and it reminds me as an architect of Brasilia or Chandigarh or places like that were created from scratch. And they're nothing more than empty shells for government. You can't you can't simulate time. The mind of one group, no matter how brilliant they are, can never replicate the embodied intelligence of a community over time. And so I'm a big believer in organic development with great leadership. But, again, some leaders see one thing and focus on one thing, other leaders see another thing, and then it's their turn and then they improve that. I don't think you can conceive of anything in whole that would ever be as good as what organically happens in some of the better examples of what we have as cities. And New York is one of the greatest, if not the greatest city on earth in so many different ways. You don't have to start from scratch. I agree with Josh.
Excellent, excellent.
If I may add, I just want to layer that in just seeing how remarkable it is to also witness how, cities can sort of leapfrog certain technologies, for example, just by virtue of being at a certain developmental stage, and then having a huge innovation that completely circumvents an age-old ancient, one of which is the grid system, and thinking around distributed power in Africa as a huge major disruption. Maybe even telecoms as an additional example too in mobile technologies in Africa. And so I think I would wholeheartedly agree with the both of you. And if I may just ask, in continuation of this point, so I mean, Josh, you mentioned earlier about digital infrastructure and data privacy. You touched a little bit on that, and I guess what another disruption that has kind of thrust us into this directional shift to the working from home model, and now we're basically so dependent on the internet. It's basically a fourth utility, right? And so, and a great feature of future cities, of course, is for optimization. People need to volunteer certain data. And this has become a point where people feel that legislation hasn't necessarily caught up to where we are. And so how do we find the balance between technological innovation in cities as we provide future services? And if there can be a balance struck between privacy, just beyond just like maybe a banner of governance, what are active steps that we can do to make people comfortable with oncoming innovation?
I think it's a great question. I think you nailed one of the most important points, which is, and I think this is true in most places, if not everywhere, that the governance efforts lag so far behind the capabilities and are really sort of like they're on two different planets. I actually think that where there's smart, thoughtful, collaborative, both industry and government and citizens working together to come up with governance regimes, it's very, very possible. And I lived through in Toronto a very rigorous public discourse, mostly about things that were actually fictional relative to the project I was involved in, but that's okay because the subject matter is so critical. And there are ways to manage who owns the data, who makes decisions about use cases for it, how to provide transparency for it. There are models out there that can be adopted, and I think it's got to be for every country at a national level, probably some global standards at some point. My hope is that one of the legacies of this pandemic, the positive legacy, is that it accelerates the discussion about that dramatically, because we get past the debate about is there value in it or not, and you start to talk about how do we do this as opposed to should we need to. So I'm optimistic about that, but there are policy strategies. There are also very interesting technologies that there are a lot of people working on using some form, and it's well beyond my technical capacity, of blockchain technology, for example, to create identity systems that would be far more effective in the way we manage identity now and far more protective. And my guess is over the next years, those kinds of tools will emerge that will make it even easier for us to solve the challenges.
Mm-hmm. Oh, brilliant. I mean, I know there's an election in the next 11 months in New York City. I think it's perfectly placed because the last 8 months have really taught us we need to really rethink what we're doing here. And the next 8 to 10 months will probably continue that much needed conversation.
Yeah.
The next, I think there's like 22 candidates running, so it should be very interesting. And I hope everyone on the call will, exercise their right and read policies and, make their vote matter. I guess just trying to summarize the essence of all the remaining questions is that accessibility is obviously a critical aspect. Accessibility in terms of those who have various abilities, whether cognitively or physically. So could we touch a bit more about that in the future of cities in any context, leaving it vague on purpose? But do you believe that people keep talking about smarter cities, and I keep reminding them it's more about like what makes a smarter city smart is being inclusive, and
Totally.
what can we do to make things more inclusive? So just some thoughts on that, Josh and Anthony.
Sure. One of the many features or characteristics, I should say, of what we were trying to do on the Toronto waterfront that didn't get enough airtime was actually a very thorough approach to the integration of accessibility into design for all different aspects. And so whether that, ranged from some of the physical, within the public realm and streetscape in buildings to actual sort of anything that had to be legible of any signage or other written materials. Accessibility covers many things. I actually think it's, it's a great point and a good call out. I sort of assume it as ingrained into all of these things, and it's probably worth calling out for its own. It's paramount and it's achievable, and all the same principles hold true. There are tools that can very easily increase accessibility without massive investment if you're intentional and think about that and want to do it deliberately. And there's we had a little building in Toronto where we had a lot of public events and this and that, and we had all kinds of things in the building that made it about, I think, probably more accessible than any building in Toronto. And didn't take that much, truth be told. So it's, again, this is an area in my view that comes directly to the core of that question about intentionality or not.
Well, so interestingly, one of the buzzwords today among interior designers of workplaces specifically is neurodiversity, and you're hearing it more and more. Neurodiversity is the current term for describing people who are different in some capacity, neurologically, and or physiologically. And so more people are spending more time focused on making sure that environments are inclusive and welcoming, accessible in that sense, to people who aren't kind of the status quo. And what's interesting, to get back to, what was interesting about what Josh was saying much earlier about, doing yoga on the roof, or, the things that are dedicated spaces don't have to remain dedicated. In fact, it's such a narrow way to think of, oh, this is a classroom, that's a yoga studio. When in fact, they're all just boxes. And if they have light and air, and doorways, then it works. And you can get multiple uses out of a single space. I think the same thing holds when you look at some of the smart technologies. And I'm not somebody to think that technology is a panacea, but where one can actually control one's environment. Already for years and years, you can control the temperature, the lighting, the size of the words on your screen, right? If you have sight issues like my elderly parents do. And technology smartly deployed that allows somebody to customize a space to themselves based on their difference is so easy to do. I mean, it's all the tech is already there. It's just a question of whether you invest in the spaces to make them tunable, which again is super, super easy and actually is not much of a premium. You just have to have the will for people that are developing them to look beyond every penny of return and make sure that there's a value proposition beyond the return.
Mhm. Fascinating. Absolutely.
Excellent. I would just, I guess we are running out of time. So as much as this conversation could go on all night, I genuinely mean that. I think we've touched on very many critical areas around cities and how they're being disrupted, how they can adapt, as well as some really exciting, technologies and innovations that touch on many broad thematic areas. I think, as we'd all love to do and continue this conversation, really, I think it's a critical one that we all feel like we're a part of as we live in this kind of changing world around us. So with that said, I would just like to say a huge thank you to Anthony and Josh, who have just really come to share, your insights and everything that you do in your work. I'm especially excited, by the way, just a shameless plug, Josh, I was on the Spotify podcast listening to Sidewalk Labs and the various technologies and disruptions that you have around cities ongoing. It's a great podcast, so I'm just definitely going to tune into that. But other than that, I would love to hand over for closing remarks to President Gerard, and who can just sort of wrap up the session. And thank you again to Shaz and Bolor, who've been excellent today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
President Gerard, unmute yourself, please.
There we go. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Lebo. Thank you, Shaz. Josh, Anthony, I really am fascinated by the presentation all of you made this evening. And I think the one thing that's paramount in my mind is one of the reasons we scheduled this tonight was to discuss what effects COVID was going to have in changing our future. And I've come to the realization that it really is not shaping our future. It's simply accelerating what was inevitable anyway. And to me, that's a very important concept to get down. That, I mean, I remember the Regional Plan Association, Al Appleton, maybe over 20 years ago, making a presentation that I was part of, discussing many of the things that were discussed tonight. And so I think one of the important issues that all of you brought up is the urgent need we all have for enlightened leadership. And this has nothing to do with party politics. This goes across party lines. This is getting people who are willing to agree to the urgent need to plan for the future, which is going to happen. There's no way we're going to stop it. I'll just put in a shameless plug here, something Lebo was saying. Rotary Club of New York, next Thursday, we are going to do another Zoom with Eric Adams, who is the borough president of Brooklyn, who is one of the leading candidates for mayor of New York City. We will have the other leading candidates for mayor of New York City as well. I urge everyone to participate, to be part of this. We have to educate our candidates as much as we want them to educate us. There is a need for enlightenment. And I'm very grateful to all of you tonight for making this crystal clear and clearing up any misconceptions that we have had, at least that I have had, as to what needs to be done for the future. The future is going to happen. We can't stop it. And what we need to do is embrace it and enjoy it and make it as beneficial to as most people as possible. So thank you, all of you, tonight. I wish all of you a happy new year. One of the things we will do, Anthony, your pod site where you do your podcast, I think if you don't mind, we will broadcast that. We will give it some advertisement. And Josh, if there's something that you want us to push for you as well, we would be very, very happy to do this. On behalf of everyone with Rotary Club of New York, thank you, Global Shapers, and thank you to all of our participants tonight. Wishing you all a good new year and a great new future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again.